And I've started the recording and we're back up on YouTube.
All right. We went into executive session to take some legal advice.
Mr. Chairman, we need a motion to come out of executive session.
So move.
About to get
Second.
entertain a motion to come out of executive session. Probably moved and seconded. Any questions? Discussion? Hearing none. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. All right, we are out of executive session. Mr. Mayor, I saw your index, I saw your hand up.
Mr. Chairman, as Councilmember Griffin had suggested before we went into executive session, could I respectfully ask for one of the representatives of the neighborhood to share with us, just for everyone's knowledge, just the level of service, kinds of service that the city has been providing for some time, and what the reasonable expectations are of the neighborhood going forward, something along those lines.
Let me recognize Mr. Winchester, and then I'll go to Ms. Rossetti. Mr. Winchester?
And thank you for your patience, by the way.
Thank you for allowing us to be here. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, well, I thank Mr. Mayor. I thank you and the rest of the folks here for allowing us to have a voice. Thank you very much. Our request, we think, is pretty reasonable. We don't wish to go down the path of, honestly, I believe, as Mr. Waring said, putting on the boxing gloves. We just quite simply want one storm drain cleaned. That has been the history of what we've been receiving in this neighborhood. I think as far back as the neighborhood has existed, that's quite simply all we want. If there needs to be a change in our expectations going forward, we can certainly kind of have a conversation about what that means for different budget years and different times. But we feel like where we are today and where we are now, based on our expectation and what our residents have been paying for 30 years across 144 homes, we just like a storm drain cleaned out.
Yes, sir. And that's normally done with the vacuum truck?
Yes, sir. I believe it is.
Yes, sir. Okay.
All right, Ms. Rossetti? I always want to call you Ms. Gainey, but anyway. You muted it.
Oh, there you go.
All right,
Gainey is fine, sir. I've been a Gainey all my life, for good or for bad.
so good.
But just to reiterate on Brandon's comments, I actually have been in the neighborhood since 1985. My father was one of the original builders in there, and we moved in '85, and the city has always given us excellent service. And we have our trash, we have the street sweepers, we have everything, the police and the fire, and we don't want drainage is a big problem here in Charleston, and we just want to make sure that we keep our neighborhood safe, and let the city help us maintain that, so that we don't have any damage in our neighborhood from flooding, which I know is a big concern for you, Mr. Mayor.
Absolutely. So thank y'all. It's unique, maybe the way this came to a head. A similar thing happened in my neighborhood, Councilmember Appel's district, where the city had traditionally been cleaning out this particular ditch, and I guess we checked a couple of years ago, particularly after this ruling came down in the state in 2017, is making it very clear that a public entity like the city is not supposed to be spending public funds on private property and for private benefit. And Councilmember Appel had a great example. It'd be like, calling the Parks Department and asking them come cut down a tree in my yard. That's not the way to do business, and it's prohibited by state law. So we're more careful about that than I guess we ever have been, and that's what got us here. So what we discussed, if you don't mind me going ahead,
Yeah, well, one of the things, Mr. Mayor, if you will, Mr. Dawson was on the line. see if he has a word or two, and then I'll come right back to you.
Okay, great.
I just agree with what Angie and Brendan have said. This isn't a new service for us. This is a service that's been provided on a regular basis. And
Yes.
up until the last 3 years, when actually the neighbor who made the phone call for years for us, told us what to do, we made the phone call, and then
Right.
we're told you're not going to do it. It's not a new service. It's a service you've always provided. And you provide other city services. I'm not sure how you delineate between what city services you will and will not provide within our neighborhood, because it's always been our understanding that our streets are private and our streets are our responsibility to maintain. But you maintain the water system, you maintain the sewer system. Why does all of a sudden the stormwater, after all these years, become an issue that it's never been before?
I think it's because of this 2017 law, state law, and our increased scrutiny about spending public funds on private property. And you own, the way I understand it, you own your own drainage system. It's not a city-owned system. Isn't that
And
correct?
how do we apply for the, how do we go about applying for the reduction in our fees as laid out in the city stormwater literature?
Well, what we were going to suggest to you after our discussion, sir, is maybe a different way to skin the cat. And just like cleaning that ditch I just mentioned in my neighborhood, we got an easement or a legal agreement from the property owners making it legal for us to come clean out that ditch, even though it's on their private property. And we're suggesting to you that we need to get our legal department together with your homeowners association. Maybe you have a legal counsel or could retain one, so that we could craft in essence, an easement agreement whereby we can continue to provide this service even though it's your private system. Does that make sense?
Good. That was, thank you, Mr. Mayor. That was we had a good hearty discussion.
Yeah.
But what we need to do is find a way to do it. And certainly our legal team is ready to speak to like our neighborhood representative or whoever y'all have as a point person on it, so we can get to a solution as opposed to a tug of war. I don't think you all want that. We don't want that.
No.
So something good can get done.
Yeah, we certainly don't, and I'm happy to be the point of contact and get things moving with our HOA. So
All right, great.
I'm not sure what the next step there is, but happy to be that point of reference.
I think the next step, Mr. Mayor, you help me out here, but I think the next step is for our legal team to reach out to their point of contact. I would suspect you, Mr. Winchester, and Ms. Copeland, Ms. Julia Copeland will probably reach out to you. Maybe offline we can exchange some contact information. I think progress will take place from there.
Much appreciated. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for your consideration.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, ma'am.
have we actually looked, or has your legal counsel actually looked at our master deed to confirm that that is not already an agreement within our master deed, that we will maintain our roadways, i.e., repave them as needed, but that the services of the city are still expected and paid for? I would believe that that would actually be in the master deed already, because again, we are not a private, we are just privately maintained roads is how I understand that. And I would love for somebody to actually say that they have taken a look at our master deed that is recorded with the city to find out if indeed it specifies what city services are expected and paid for by the neighborhood.
You know what? I think one good thing about this process, and I thank Mr. Fountain, our stormwater department head, as a result of this, we all gonna learn going forward on this one. We all gonna. It would be so good if that's in that master deed, but I promise you, I think through this process that'll be reviewed because we're gonna get to a solution on this one. So everybody's pushing in that direction. So it'll happen.
Yeah.
Mr. Mayor.
Yeah, Brandon, maybe you could get together whatever documents you have like that. That'd be a good thing to reference and look through as we figure this one out.
Absolutely. And I have Ms. Copeland, I have your email already. I'll reach out to you and I'll see if I can get some of that information on our side. And hopefully we can get some answers to all this and make progress. And again, much appreciated this group for being open and trying to explore this. Thank you.
That goes both ways. Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Any final discussions on that? We've got one other item to discuss. And if you all want to stay in there with us on this, you're certainly welcome to stay. But we're going to be talking about fill and bill on the next item, just as a discussion. So probably be seeing you all later. Talk to you soon on this one.
No, thank you.
Well, have a good Thanksgiving. Have a good Thanksgiving.
You all as well.
All right. We had Councilman Jackson and Griffin on this one. So Councilman Griffin, I'm going to reach out to you first, and then I'm going to ask Ms. Jackson. To,
I would just defer my time to Matt Fountain.
Okay, Mr. Fountain, I'm sorry. Let me go to Mr. Fountain, and then I come to you, Council Leader Jackson.
I can certainly talk a little bit about it, Mr. Chairman, and kind of where the history is and where we stand. This has been brought up certainly originally by Councilmember Griffin, and then certainly Councilman Jackson and a number of other council members have chimed in over the last couple of years, looking at ways to restrict the use of fill in the city, especially with the history of the flooding that has been caused by stormwater fill. There's a number of things we could look at with fill and Dale would talk about this, Mr. Morris, in great detail, from ecological impacts and other considerations, but we've always looked at it purely from a flooding perspective. Mm-hmm. We have made a number of steps since that time, everything from the Church Creek fill mitigation ordinances within the stormwater manual, then the new stormwater manual in 2020 that followed that up, expanding considerations of fill with flooding across the entire city special protection area, so not the entire city. And then we've recently been working, as we I think last updated probably the committee on a few months ago, working on an ordinance to restrict or look at restricting slab on grade foundation types within the special flood hazard area, basically the 100-year floodplain. That's something we've spent quite a bit of time talking with stakeholders on so far, looking at how that would impact affordable housing, how it impact planning through the community, environmental impacts. Now we need to kind of circle back around with the home builder side of this and see what concerns they might have and what they might be willing to support or have challenges with, and try to draft that into a more formal ordinance to bring to council. So that's kind of where we're sitting with the work that we've done. It's been a little bit delayed as we've had our floodplain manager resign a few months ago, so we've been somewhat without some of the support staff that we would normally use to do this work, but it's still on our active project plate. It's just taking a little bit longer than we would like it to.
Okay. Council Lady Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the opportunity to join your committee today. I put this forward, to you and to the mayor, hoping that this would be the opportunity to sort of get a third bite at the banning, fill, and build apple that began after the Dutch dialogues were adopted in 2019, and then continued until earlier this year under Councilmember Griffin's sponsorship to bring forward the same opportunity to be more restrictive with the concerns that we have with the kind of construction that we've seen, historically in the city that's allowed currently in order to meet the base elevation of any one property. We don't have any current restrictions on literally bringing in dirt. We've got more of a formulaic way of doing that now under the new stormwater manual. So I've been along for that ride. I've been very, glad and appreciative of all the hard work, especially as Mr. Fountain took his job in the new stormwater department. So the way that I was looking at this in terms of timing, you have sort of a council that's been educated and knowledgeable and given the wisdom that has accumulated since the Dutch dialogues. And now I went back and looked at the transcript for the discussion that the council entertained, because the same process, your committee looked at this in February of 2021, February 22nd, I think was the council meeting. So the 21st of February is when you last had this kind of discussion. And at that point it was, well, yes, now we have the stormwater manual in place. We are seeing that that has had its own positive impact in the way that there's now the formula that dirt, if it's brought in, some has to be taken out. And we've got that kind of, construction industry education going on. But the discussion at your committee and then council in February of earlier this year was that, well, once we have the city plan completed, and we know that we were bringing in the same Dutch Dialogues consultants, and now we're totally, blessed by having one of the Wagner and Ball lead consultants, Mr. Morris, as our own a resiliency officer. So the conversation during that council discussion in February of this year was that, well, we know that we're going to want to widen the reach of a protective ordinance like this that would hopefully be the solution to how we're concerned about the results of fill construction continuing to have more of a potential impact, negative impact on surrounding properties. And we know that a lot of this has involved what I would call infill development, where there's existing neighborhoods or existing properties contiguous or in a nearby location. And then we see a new, vacant piece of property all of a sudden filled in. It's not necessarily huge numbers, but it's usually in the middle of existing properties that are already dealing with their own flood from aging infrastructure and things like that. So that's the way I was looking at this. You have a council that's been educated ever since the Dutch dialogues. Councilmember Griffin and I are leaving the council at the end of this year, as you all know. I feel like we're sort of veterans in understanding how all of this works and why we were concerned from the beginning of trying to bring this kind of ordinance forward. And that's my rationale for asking you to entertain it yet again. I took the liberty, I know staff time is, precious. I know that, Mr. Fountain's department has been missing a key part of his operation in the floodplain management function. I know that everybody's stretched thin. So after speaking with Mr. Morris over the last week, I took the liberty of basically just editing, revising the whereas part of the ordinance that was in front of the council in February of 2021, because at that time we were still referencing the Dutch dialogues and what we had learned from them. So just one key whereas that I updated, because now we do have the city plan land and water analysis. So my update to the ordinance that was in front of you in February just reads like this. Whereas the overall recommendation in the city plan land and water analysis incorporated and affirmed the Dutch dialogues 2018 studies and recommendations for the city to adopt measures to reduce negative impacts of fill. And so basically we're at the cumulative point where we've done our due diligence for that many years, since 2018, when the Dutch dialogue studies were conducted. And 4 years later, we know what we know, and we know that we want to start protecting watersheds that are impacted by the elevation of particular properties. And that's what I think this would do. It would be a shorter term preventive measure in operation, preventing some of the smaller infill that I see all the time out here on James Island. There's people are taking bigger properties and having them subdivided, knocking down the older, smaller homes and building newer homes that are not well sited in order to protect their neighbors as they are completed and occupied. So that's my inspiration. That's my discussion request of you all, that you would entertain having what I would consider, let's just call it a stopgap measure that was thoroughly discussed over the last 4 years in place while you're waiting to do a comprehensive rewrite of your zoning code, as the planning director has put on the council for budget approval. And we know that that's going to take 2 years before the full consultant services work that Mr. Summerfield is proposing to the council will be completed and adopted. A lot can happen in 2 years in terms of construction, development. There's a lot of properties here on James Island that I'm very familiar with are being carefully, scrubbed and analyzed and evaluated for infill development. And that concerns me greatly. So that's why I'm here. And I really appreciate the opportunity to put this on your plate. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Councilor Jackson. Any additional comments or discussion to be had on that? Hearing none. Maybe Councilor Jackson, you might want to just push that out the email to the rest of the council to look at. I see Mr. Morris has come on. You have some comments, Mr. Morris?
Yes, Council Chairman Waring. Thank you for this opportunity to join you. This is an issue that is sort of near and dear to my heart. Just want to start from the largest perspective here. This is really about water discharge and water storage so that we protect neighborhoods and citizens' homes, keep them safe over the next number of years, hopefully for the life of the structure. And this is about future risks because we know things are going to change. And one of the things that change within the watersheds is when you put fill in them, it changes the hydrology. It can often change the infiltration capacity of the soil, the storage capacity of the basin, and all those other things. So when we teed this up in the Dutch dialogues, it was very clear that we were deeply concerned what we saw on Johns Island about the development that was going on out there and the amount of fill that was being used, particularly in low-lying areas, it's sort of towards the bottom, to the terminus of the floodplain where it meets the tidal zone. So we recommended, please, move to an elevation-based approach for development. And the comp plan, you don't know how excited I am about that, but the comp plan is teed this up. And there's going to be some really hard work over the next couple of years to possibly turn that into zoning code language. And that's not going to be easy, but it is a worthwhile endeavor. And I think it's an important endeavor. That said, between now and then, we have some development that's going to occur. Are the stormwater regulations that we have now sufficient to continue to mitigate or to mitigate even more in other parts of the cities, the use of fill in the lowest lying areas? So I worked on and we have the land and water analysis recommendations. There we talk about 4 zones: the tidal zone, the compound flood zone, the adapt zone, and the high ground zone. And one of the things that is tricky there is those do not necessarily overlap with what we call the regulatory floodplain. And as I was looking at the one that the firm maps over this weekend and looking at the regulatory floodplain for 1 in 500 year events, it is very clear that kind of approach could be less than elegant and could be subject to some legal challenges. So I was concerned about that. And when Mr. Fountain came to me this morning and we discussed this a little bit further, it is very clear that his department, they're thinking well about how to achieve the benefit of no fill in the lowest lying zones, but still enable some activity to occur. So if you look back at the Dutch Dialogue's recommendations, it's clear that we never said don't use fill ever across the city. We said use fill judiciously in the higher zones, clearly for ingress and egress to neighborhoods, public safety purposes and things like that. But a complete ban on fill in the lowest lying areas, maybe at the bottom of floodplains where they intersect with the tidal areas, or the V zones and the AE zones where they come together. I think that is something to ponder. But I don't have an easy solution here, but I do appreciate the struggle that's gone on this issue. And I read all the notes and the minutes from the debates over the last 2 years as much as I could get my hand on. Very clear there's a lot of challenges here. I applaud the work that's already been done, and I'm willing to ponder along with Mr. Fountain's staff and the planning staff and this committee what more we could do about it. I think this is an important initiative, but again, we have to make sure it would withstand legal scrutiny and doesn't harm the other needs we have in the city.
Thank you, Mr. Morris. I saw Councilman Griffin hand. Councilman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I brought this up before. Council Lady Jackson has brought this up before. We brought this up multiple times. And to be honest with you, it hasn't gotten a lot of traction with our council. And so at some point, I think you have to quit trying to do the same thing over and over again, because it just isn't working the way that I think we intended it to work. I don't think it's the pleasure of this council to come up with a ban on fill and build because that creates a lot of legal issues. When I talked to Mr. Morris a couple of years ago or earlier this year, when he was still at the Water Institute of the Gulf, he referenced two major projects that we were working on that we had got grants for, the NIFWIF grants. And we were looking to see how they were going to impact some of these zones that had been talked about in the Dutch Dialogue Report. And we're not through with those studies yet. We haven't gotten to conclusions. We haven't been able to draw conclusions from this NIFWIF money that we've got. So I think that it's still too premature to say this is what we need to do. I think that we need to defer to our staff at this point. They need to continue to make it a priority. It's been implemented within the stormwater manual. And when I brought this up earlier this year, I got pushback from members of this committee and from Council Lady Jackson, who said, we're serving on the stormwater manual committee. I think Councilmember Shea had served on it as well. And this was specifically added to the stormwater manual, which gives our staff the opportunity to make sure that we implement these ideals. So I've seen it progress over the last couple of years, and I just don't think at this time, especially as I'm winding down my last few weeks on council, that we should try to cram this thing through. I think you're going to have some new people coming on council in a few weeks. They're going to have some ideas that may be able to enhance this process moving forward. I appreciate Council Lady Jackson for bringing this up again, because it is such an important issue on James Island, Johns Island, and West Ashley and Church Creek. And it has to continue to be something that this committee talks about long after I'm gone off this committee. But I just don't see the time there to try to push this thing through in the next few weeks. And so I don't think we should be spending too much attention when we've got a very important budget that we need to pass. But I do want to thank Council Lady Jackson. And obviously, this is something I'm going to look back on 20 years from now and say, you know, I wish I could have done more in my 4 years about this topic and Church Creek in general. And I'm never going to fault anybody for bringing it up, because it really is the future of our city. If we allow people to come and fill in our wetlands and fill in our low elevation zones, we are going to never solve this problem that we have. But does that mean that we're going to be able to push an amendment or an ordinance through in the next 6 weeks? I just don't think that's the pleasure of this committee, nor the pleasure of this council. I may be wrong, but that's just kind of the appetite that I've gotten lately, and the fact that we've tried this multiple times and it hasn't worked this way. So maybe we need to take a different approach.
Thank you, Councilman. I see the mayor's hand up. Mr. Mayor.
How many of y'all have read that history of drainage that Nick Butler's wife wrote? I'm towards the end of it now. It's fascinating. And Councilmember Griffin, I'm not suggesting at all that we unnecessarily take time, but a lot of the whole history of 50 years of Charleston has been all about filling. So it's amazing
You're right about that.
that we're talking about this. And I also know, I was just reading a section last night about, I guess I'm in the 1920s right now, and the city Public Works Department and mayor and council members, they were all bemoaning the fact, this was in 1920, that there was too much deferred maintenance of the systems that weren't taken care of. So for what it's worth, this has been going on for a while. So I wonder, two questions, and probably mostly to Matt here. Do we, and I'm hearing there's, some places where fill would be okay, maybe in the higher elevations, and not okay in others. Are we even keeping track? Do we know like how many slab on grade structures got approved in the last 6 months or a year?
So that side, Mayor, would be something building inspections would probably have better access to than stormwater, because they'll approve those foundation plans. But we certainly see both construction methods being built still. We still see quite a bit of elevated home coming in, especially in areas now that, as property values continue to increase, we're seeing desires for park under, that kind of thing, which gets you more, more use of your property for structure.
Right.
And then, but we do in some of the areas still see slab on grade, frequently in higher elevations where not as much fill is needed. But there's been a little bit of a balance, because fill has honestly gotten quite a bit more expensive as the local borrow pits have mostly been used up and they're trucking from further and further away. We're starting to see fill coming down in usage. And then separate from that, of course, the new stormwater manual, if you're in an area of known flooding, you have to account for the impacts of any fill you use on stormwater on the site, which makes it much harder to do major fill projects in low-lying areas. I mean, it really is a very difficult thing to do.
So I hear you. And this might not have been for the benefit of all the committee, but I saw in your response by email to Councilmember Jackson that the Stormwater Department has had some progress on putting together a concept ordinance to prevent building both slab on grade foundations and raised slab foundations for single family homes within the 100-year floodplain. So how reasonably close are you to having that concept ordinance written up? Because I think to Councilmember Griffin's point, we don't want to rush it, but we don't want to wait till the zoning rewrite occurs. And maybe there's some sweet medium here, but what do you think? Where are we on this?
Yeah, so we've come up with kind of the concept of what I would call like the legal, it's not the legal framework, it's the execution-based framework of like how would you enforce it to some extent? Where would it be bounded? What types of foundations would be okay, and in what areas? We've started talking with the stakeholder groups. We still need to do some outreach with that concept with the home builder side of the stakeholder group to see what concerns they might have and see where we could kind of help address that within our ordinance. Then we have to do the actual legal legwork of how do you actually fit it into the city muni code of how does it actually fit into the code of ordinances we have? Where does it sit? What are the enforcement mechanisms within the ordinance? What are the penalties if you don't comply? Which I think we figured out, again, a conceptual way to deal with that with basically through getting your CO like it would be in a building permit. Then we have to talk to the building inspections department and make sure they're comfortable with that in their workflow, and build the internal side of the workflow process, make sure it's not too much of a lift. Then it comes back generally to council and we say, okay, here's something we've presented. Here's what any cost implications would be for doing it from a execution standpoint at the city staffing level. Here are the options, which, we've, like, for instance, we've used a 100-year floodplain. You could go out to a 500-year floodplain. You could narrow it down to a smaller area than a 100-year floodplain. Here are the thoughts we have. Here are the concerns from the stakeholder communities. And then basically council would have that ability to discuss if they feel comfortable with proceeding with that type of approach. So I would think we're probably realistically a few months away, but no longer years away. It's a lot's been done in the last 6 months, but it's a slow and steady process, especially without the floodplain manager, unfortunately, at the moment.
All right. Well, with that, this is on as a discussion. We are now getting pretty close to 5:30. Ms. Jackson, I'm gonna recognize you, but let's try to keep it short and sweet.
Thank you. I do just, since this is probably going to be my last word as an elected official on this topic, but I need to go on the record. I did not put the language on the agenda that this would be a discussion on banning fill and build. My idea, and I know it was, over a brief text discussion with you, Chairman Waring, so I appreciate the shortcut. But basically, my request was that we go back to the ordinance that was put forward to the council in full in February of 2021. And basically, the reasons for looking at this now was that we had completed the work that we said we still needed to do in February by getting the land and water analysis recommendations and results. So that was my rationale. And the ordinance that was looked at by the council and, basically deferred because we didn't have the city plan analysis, basically talked about fill requirements. So 0 fill in the wet zone, which is defined as 0 to 6 feet above sea level, and then limited fill in the ecological zone. And that basically is where you would have fill that makes sense for roads and anything else that would be necessary in an infill development in a higher elevation. So I need to be on record. I'm not a ban fill and for any place, anytime, any reason. And I'm also, the only thing that I said in February, I said I came ready to vote, give that ordinance a first reading. My only request at that time was that it be expanded beyond Church Creek and Johns Island, which is where it had rested. I wanted it to be eligible to other elevation locations in the different boroughs of our city. So those are my 2 reasons for tonight. It needs to go to work on James Island and the other places that I know and love. And it also needs to go to work in a more practical way of not banning, but guiding and regulating fill. So I'll be happy to come and support this as a citizen.
Okay, thank you, Council Lady. Any more information to come before the committee today?
Well, let me just follow up and ask Matt
Yes, sir,
Fountain
Mr. Smith.
about the direction he's headed with the ordinance he just spoke of. Would it not include what Councilmember Jackson just suggested, that it be citywide, that it basically do the things that she described?
So it's related but slightly different, Mr. Mayor. I mean, it would be citywide in terms of the special flood hazard area, the 100-year floodplain.
Right.
It wouldn't be limited to a geographical location other than the 100-year floodplain, or potentially 500-year floodplain if you want to expand it. It is more permissive of fill though than what Councilman Jackson had proposed, that we would be basically removing the somewhat of an incentive for fill to say, if you put that extra bit of fill in, you can build slab on grade, which is frequently a cheaper construction methodology than crawl space, by saying, well, you're still going to have to build crawl space. There's no reason to bring in your extra fill material from a cost perspective. It also provides some resiliency that crawl space homes are much easier to elevate if there's ever a change in the floodplain later and that area suddenly is flooding because it was mismapped, as happened certainly in Councilman Griffin's district with Church Creek. That's more the thrust we were looking at this point, where the comp plan really focused in on more of the elevation-based zoning and how to address it. And the reason we did that is that it's a good approach and it makes a lot of sense. It's a much more challenging regulatory lift of how you physically do it in the city processes and what methodology there is for basically review and enforcement and action within that, based on how individual lots are currently brought in for development. There's just it's not as straightforward a process methodology. And that's exactly what zoning is for, right? Zoning is a process methodology, a very complex one that the city already has in place. So it's a good place to do that work.
Yeah. Okay,
listen, we've had a good holly round on this one, but I think we have to bring this discussion to a close. This is certainly going to go into next year. I think I like the methodical approach that Mr. Fountain has described. Be interesting to see what you're talking about, Council Lady, how that's going to apply to, for example, Laurel Island, when that begins to be developed over there. So, so I'm sure we'll have more input, but let's entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Probably moved and we had a
Second.
second adjournment, probably moved and second by acclamation. We stand adjourned. Listen, everybody have a great Thanksgiving.
Thank
And
you.
on council, we'll see one another tomorrow, but well, this year has blown by.